Well, Studio Trigger did it once again. The trailer for Cyberpunk Edgerunners Season 2 dropped almost 2 weeks ago, and from day one it had people hooked, talking about the characters, drawing art, making memes and speculating which tragic fates they'll meet. Me included, because come on, if they decide to have Roman go full Nightcrawler, that would be just absolute kino. But what I found particularly interesting is how far that speculation went. People weren't just guessing at plot beats. They were already writing headcanons, imagining 10 seasons worth of story arcs, whole relationships and fates for these characters. And that despite, at least at that point, having basically nothing else to go on, apart from a few hints about their backgrounds, some character bios and a trailer. Thinking about this reignited a video idea I had actually scrapped a while back, built around a similar principle. How do you hook people on a story using nothing but its characters and a few vibes? How do you get an audience so invested that they are already writing their own stories in their heads and care that much about your world before you explained a single thing about it, using nothing but first impressions? Stay tuned if that sounds interesting to you. And staying true to that example, let me put my claim up front, that example characters can build a world in people's minds faster than most lore dumps ever will. Isn't that exactly what that trailer did, if you saw it before clicking on this video, or just a few glimpses of its material here? Nobody explained to you what Night City is, or introduced you to the at this point 30 plus years of accumulated lore behind it. A handful of characters just demonstrated it, and this video, a bit shorter and probably ramblier than usual, is my attempt to explain why that works, how it works and how the underlying principles might be replicated, and this particularly in the field Cyberpunk 2077 and Edgerunners themselves emerged from, and a great passion of mine, namely tabletop role-playing games. Though I'm confident that the broader claim and some of the following observations would also hold worth for many other creative projects, be it a comic's first issue or novel's opening chapter. But when it comes to the focus of this video, using these methods to set up a tabletop campaign and putting in players through iconic figures and exemplars of a setting, what led me to this idea was the humble, often overlooked Premade character. And it's especially the latter case where I'd stake my claim to originality here. Just telling you to give your characters a memorable design and demeanor to draw an audience in, that's like writing 101. There are plenty of videos on YouTube about it already, and you certainly don't need little me for that. And if you're subscribed to my channel, which I of course would recommend, your feed is already likely full of them, I would presume. My interest here though is something a bit more specific. The idea properly clicked when I was reading back over some of the template characters in the old rulebooks for Vampire the Masquerade. For those not in the know, pre-made characters are meant as ready-to-play builds for players, like you'd find in most systems, but also intended to be NPCs for the storyteller to use, or just serve as general examples for their clans. And so, fittingly, they're not just stat blocks but also come with their own little backstory and personality. I was instantly intrigued by them, arguably even more than by the lore itself, at least at first. They are what actually drew me into the setting, once I got my hands on a few rulebooks. Take this one for example. The successful Mars Embrace, arguably my favorite. An old grandmother hit by a hard life. Her deadbeat husband drank himself to death, the son who joined the army died, and the rest of her children grew up to be complete failures. Their own kids in turn are either dealing drugs, selling them themselves, or both. And that was her life before she got turned into a vampire, during a massacre carried out by the most violent vampire sect of the modern knights, the Sabbat. So how does Granny handle getting thrown into this violent supernatural world? Most of her new brothers and sisters underestimate her, and perhaps to their own detriment. Many younger vampires quickly take to a strict but motherly attitude. It's one of the last anchors they have to what little humanity's left in them. And the ones who outrank her in vampire years, all embrace at a younger human age than her unusually high one, well, her many decades of hard-won working-class human experience and the tenacity and wit honed by it might just be the edge that lets her outlast them all. This anime girl-looking one is dubbed the Nexus, a young girl whose home troubles took the form of moving doors, floating objects and other seemingly poltergeist-related activity. The self-proclaimed parapsychologist who came to investigate eventually figured out those phenomena were actually her own latent telekinetic powers, and promptly abducted her. He was of course a vampire of the magically gifted Tremere, all too happy to have such a prodigy join their clan's endless quest for arcane knowledge and the power that comes with it. She herself found plenty to like about her new life, but she still harbors some resentment at having her childhood stolen from her. And despite her 3 whopping dots in thaumaturgy, marking her as a genuinely powerful blood mage, she reigns trapped in an immature body. Or take this righteous schizo, a paranoid talk show radio host who never stopped his fight against the countless conspiracies lurking in the shadows, threatening us all. He kept it up even after joining Clan Malkavian, who was said to be clairvoyant but without exception also all have at least a few screws loose, and so he made quite the fitting addition to their ranks. Or this wretched creature, the revolting Revenant, hailing from a family born and bred for generations to serve their vampire masters, and through that service having acquired a near absolute control over the animals that surround her, with whom she shares a very deep connection, and without getting too explicit here, even a bit more than that. Which I guess first and foremost just tells you how crazy and out there things can get in VTM when it comes to both player characters and NPCs. And that is my entire point here. For even if you don't know a thing about VTM's lore, these characters already tell you plenty. About their own story, and about what might await you in this world. But more than that, they instantly communicate the setting's tone. This world is weird and dangerous, filled with broken and dangerous people, and pure, unfiltered, prime-cut, transgressive theater kid edge. This is the world of darkness. Your shabby downtown apartment, the hum of a flickering CRT TV, the full ashtray and half-eaten pizza on the stained coffee table, barely masking the smell of the excrement-covered street outside and the sound of the couple next door having a domestic for the 3rd time this week. All while in their high ivory towers, the rich and powerful bloodsuckers lord over us all. Quite literally in some cases. At least that's the mental image that comes to me immediately. A spitfire on modernity, mainstream society, and the man in general. A shower romantic tale of liminal myth for America. A cold and fallen world, disorienting and dreary, like a lot of films from the late 90s and early 2000s, but bound together by a clear aesthetic thread and vision, beautiful even in its ugliness. It was a similar feeling I had watching the trailer for Edgerunners 2. Of course, it did the same thing and instantly had people speculating. Night City is a place where a young girl could end up in a gang of dangerously deranged and lethally chromed up lunatics, where a young man could be filming tragedies for profit or end up flatline chasing the truth instead, because in Night City trying to be a principled journalist might as well be a death sentence in the long run, where people can be haunted by their past and by things far worse if half the fan theories about D turn out to be true. And there's always the expectation, whether it ends in guns blazing glory or a heartbreaking downfall, that this story won't have a happy ending. All of which, of course, matters a great deal when it comes to running a campaign or building a world. Now compare that to a system built on the exact opposite premise. In my more recent memory, the 5th edition of The Dark Eye pulled off the same trick, just pointed in a completely different direction. Fronting its new release with pre-made archetypes and a cast of recurring iconic heroes. Characters established enough to get featured not just in rulebook art, but as in-a-universe asides commenting on the actual articles. There's Hilbert, the blessed one of Perrain, a cleric of the harvest goddess. Lacking in combat ability maybe, but a gifted healer, and a welcome sight to peasants and farmers alike, with respect and gratitude he wins easily. Rowena, the traveling cat witch, always accompanied by a trusted familiar, gifted with the spells of her tradition and their feared curses, and while good-natured, still met with suspicion and sometimes worse by the superstitious peasantry she moves among. Or Carolyn, the mischievous half-elven drifter, quick with a rapier, quicker with other people's pockets, and perhaps quickest at finding his ways into the bedchambers of both sexes, as well as finding himself in trouble for the two former habits. For more martial examples, there's Garon Orphanmaker, your typical human male fighter, a witty mercenary of the Midrealm, and the rambunctious Hedja called Tjalva, an adventurous warrior of the Thorwalians, the Dark Eye's beloved answer to the Vikings. And of course, none of them carry the nihilism you would expect from a VTM character. The setting has its darker corners, sure, but the core atmosphere is a lighter one. Mostly benevolent rulers, pious priests, and a pantheon of gods that, while not exactly proactive, isn't absent, and chivalry too is still very much alive and kicking. Your worries here aren't urban decay or existential dread. They're about, honestly, remembering the customs of an absurdly detailed world and navigating the countless, sometimes deeply simulationist focus rules the system is famous for. And to speak in game, while not at all a stranger to fights and battles, your typical adventure is less about delving into dungeons and fighting dragons, and more about discovering that the mayor's daughter was transformed into a cat by a coven of witches feuding with the village, and then trying to find your party's own solution to that conflict. And notice what just happened here. 2 systems, 2 sets of characters, and neither one needed a word of lordom to land. Even a glance at the VTM templates tells you that everybody here is a little broken, the world is dark and cool, and the tone is edgy, transgressive, and dripping in the goth punk aesthetic of the late 90s and 2000s. A glance at the Dark Eye templates tells you the opposite. The world of Aventuria sits comfortably somewhere between high and low fantasy, borrowing equally from the fantastical and the historical, from fairy tales and mythology, all while covered in a certain Renaissance fair flair. Same technique, completely different world. That's the whole thesis in a miniature. But before I get into the details of how, let me address the why. Sure, something similar could be said about origin characters in RPGs like Baldur's Gate or Divinity, or the character highlights used as teasers for upcoming comics or shows, like Edgerunners itself did. But not only do pre-made characters achieve that informing work without strings attached, since they remain optional to your actual campaign or setting, I would also argue it's specifically at the tabletop gaming table that they can be used to quickly and efficiently establish the world, the type of people who inhabit it, and the tone of the setting. Surely that potential hasn't gone unnoticed in rulebooks, but curiously enough, at least here on YouTube, I haven't seen people talk about using pre-made characters deliberately in this function. Perhaps because it's just something that comes rather naturally, but I do think it's worth pursuing with intent. After all, it's also the gaming table that profits most from this, precisely because it's collaborative. It can head off problems before they even start. Not only does this give play an idea of what's ahead, it can also ease tonal conflicts and the frustration that comes with them, a rather minor but easy source of friction when setting up a TTRPG campaign. If a player wants to play a Robin Hood type or a Punisher like ruthless vigilante delivering street justice, both likely motivated by injustice or tragic past, in a noble bright high fantasy world where most people are decent, the authorities aren't corrupt, tragic fates aren't common, and every tavern corner is well lit, they might quickly end up a rebel without any cause. Think about it, a character like Bronn is fun because of the world he exists in, being an honest cutthroat in a world full of hypocrites. Put him in something as mostly cozy as Freeran and he would feel out of place. Or maybe not so much. Him perhaps joking when he said he would kill children hits very differently next to a guy like Verbal, but you likely get what I mean. Of course there are other tools for this too, the classic one being a session 0, where you sit down with 5 players and talk expectations before anyone rolls a character. And while I'm not opposed to trigger warnings or X cards, I've always been a bit skeptical of them. The former because they risk spoiling the plot and can be so transparent they take some of the thrill out of things. The latter because they've always felt a bit unwieldy to me. Though that might just be because in my personal, perhaps sheltered experience I really can't think of any situation in which they might have been needed. So if you want to be more subtle about it, using pre-made characters for that purpose in a more elusive and natural way could be an option. As you just watched happen here, twice even. Something similar applies to shows or fiction more broadly. Tone and setting get communicated instantly in the first episode, and while there might be twists and turns down the line, throwing a real curveball is risky. You can introduce a story as gothic horror, lure the audience in with that, then reveal it's actually Lovecraftian horror, like Bloodborne did, and did so masterfully. But I imagine we would be having a very different conversation if halfway through it turned out to be secretly a racing game. Though I feel like you already understand what I'm getting at here. So much for the why, now to the how. As I said, these pre-made characters work because they establish several things at once. What kind of world this is, what kind of people live in it, and what the setting's overall tone is. And by extension, the mindset you walk in with, showing rather than telling. Or more concretely, writing a handful of such template characters and handing them out to your players, and designing them deliberately with that purpose in mind. For many smaller details of the lore, this is a much quicker way to let them understand what kind of adventure this will be. Subtly, but not so subtly it feels heavy-handed. While not strictly necessary, giving their background some connections to each other might be an easy way to show the relations between factions within the world. After all, something similar happens in systems more oriented towards one-shots like Call of Cthulhu, where many modules even come with fitting, pre-made characters that already have established goals and relationships. Because for an adventure that only lasts a single session, the introduction has to be even more efficient. But that doesn't mean in reverse that using them just as appetizers for your players wouldn't be beneficial if you're planning a longer campaign. Quite the opposite, I would argue. And even better, using them with such deliberation doesn't stay limited to just lore. For example, if the players are new to the system, it also hints of what kind of builds they could make. And especially if it's a more complicated one, can serve as an example for them to orient themselves around. Serving as guideposts for the hard rules of the system or the requirements of a campaign would also be quite handy. After all, miscommunication there is another kind of thing that can cause problems once the adventure really starts. If your campaign is meant to end up as a low fantasy tale of gritty mercenaries in the long run, an Icehammer Paladin or a Dragonblood Sorcerer might break that atmosphere. And in reverse, as fun as an entire barbarian party enrolled at a mage academy sounds for one session, those jokes will wear thin eventually. And mechanically, in many cases, it will either be way too easy for them or way too hard. If that hint is given and taken, it saves the GM a lot of headaches and constant campaign replanning. Sure, when in doubt, just talk things out openly with your players. That's always the better option if the hint alone doesn't land. But even then, or if the players never actually use these characters, the effort of making them isn't wasted. First, there's the simple option of using them as NPCs or with some adjustments as enemies, as most rulebooks already offer. And even if that opportunity never arises, as you build them yourself, you can treat them as practice. Especially when done early, they're an anchor point for your own thinking about the campaign you're designing, both in terms of lore and mechanics. In this light, while I think it's smart to make a number of them roughly matching your player count, just in case they do get used, nothing stops you from stopping there, or from building up a small gallery of them that might come in handy when you're in a tight spot or need to improvise. On another helpful note, if you're new to the system or carrying the Game Master's burn for the first time, they might help you to get familiar with the rules more intimately than just trying to hammer them into your head. Or they might serve as excellent stress dummies for your own mechanics if you're designing homebrew content on an entire system. And this sense of being guideposts for both audience and creator, at least on a narrative level, works in other fields too. At least from my own observation and experience, many creative works often start with ideas for certain characters, striking design concepts or concept art in the creators' heads, rather than specific plot points. For the audience, comic books do it with splash page team intros, establishing a universe's stakes and tone before a single line of exposition. Novels do it by opening on a minor doomed POV character instead of the protagonist, a device that establishes the stakes and cruelty of a world before you even meet the people who actually matter. George R. Martin, for example, uses this constantly. And if it works there, why shouldn't it work in TTRPGs? As said, this principle itself isn't all that original, and it's already well discussed in other fields, which is exactly why I feel so confident in it here, and it is used for setting up your own campaign in the ways described. After all, in every case it's the same trick at the heart of this whole video. Characters often deliver and inspire tone and stakes far faster than any long-winded exposition ever could. So, going back to where we started, Trigger didn't need to explain a single thing about Night City's history or its current situation to draw new fans in and have old fans theorize on what they know. A handful of characters did all of that work for them. And whether you're setting up your own campaign or some other creative work of your own, the lesson learned here stays largely the same. As much as I enjoy even the pitfalls of detailed world building, there are other paths you can use to start out from. If you struggle with writing history and politics first, start simpler. Write one person who could only exist in that world, maybe another, and see where they connect, and go from there. And eventually hand them over to your audience or your players as a teaser for what you have in store for them. One that not only informs them on what is on the menu, but leaves them hungry for more.